Good morning, everybody. How are we doing?
Okay.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday is right.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
We made it again. There's a lot to be said for that, you know. All right.
Fridays are good.
Fridays are good. Every day is good.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Every day you
Yeah.
wake up and can look at the sunshine.
And it's a gift.
That's right. All right. Let's see. I need to kind of pull that off. Okay. Good. Now I can close some windows here. And we should be good to go. So everybody doing all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doing good.
Anybody working hard at that challenge project? Because that's, what is that?
Yes.
Is that next week? No, it's the week after. That's right.
I sent you mine in already. Hopefully you got it.
Yeah, I saw some of the
I
things.
sent some to you to myself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I saw
Yeah,
that.
I sent something. I need your suggestion. How
Yeah.
about the land out? Is okay. I will continue to do it.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that a little bit this afternoon. Okay, because we're going to be actually looking at some of the things that people are, doing as preliminary work. Well, I hope it's
Maybe not.
I can't talk. It's Friday. Preliminary.
It may be completed.
Yeah. But what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about an ink wash technique. Okay. Now, in my previous life as an illustrator, one of the things that I relied on heavily, because I could do it easily and quickly, was a technique that they call dry brush and ink wash. Okay. Now, different people approach it differently, right? Some people like to use like these metal, these steel, drawing or writing pins, that you can get different nibs and you dip it in and you draw and you make a line in ink. Now, the advantage of using ink over using, say, like watercolor, for example, right, is that once that ink is down and it's dry, it's not ever going anywhere, okay? It's permanent, right? So you can't move it, right? And there's advantages to that in the sense that you can work and you can build up layer after layer and, begin to really adjust your values and push some things much darker. The thing is, you have to kind of approach it somewhat cautiously, right? You have to have a plan. It's not a real, like, free, spontaneous, flexible medium that you can keep moving around. It's like once it's down there, it's down. Okay. Now I'm going to hold something up, and I'll put a shot of this up later. Okay. So what I did this morning is I took a few minutes, and I got this pad. I'll show it to you. It's just kind of, rather inexpensive, cheap watercolor paper. Okay. And it's cold press. It has a bit of a tooth to it. It doesn't have a lot. It's not like real rough, right? It's just kind of medium. But what I did is I took a little bit of time, and with a pen, and I'll show you this pen. It's right here. And let me turn it. Okay. Yeah, something kind of like about right there. Okay.
It's upside down.
Upside down.
Upside down.
Upside down.
Yes. All right. Anyway, it's made by a company called Sakura. Okay. It's a Japanese company. Here we go. All right. And this is a brush pen. Now you can get these in black, but you can also get them in brown, right? And I tend to really like the brown ink rather than black ink, because black can get kind of dark and kind of cold feeling, you know, but the brown has kind of a warm feeling to it. And so it gives your drawings, I think, you know, a little more life, right? Just a preference, all right? You can use either, all right? But what I did this morning is I sat here with this brush pen and I drew out this rather exotic looking flower. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, this is called a curriculum, all right? I got about 4 of these over at Home Depot because they were such weird looking flowers. They're almost like flowers within a flower, okay? And I've got them growing out there in a pot. This is just like the head, you know, one flower out of there. And they're very tropical looking. But, you know, they have, let's see, you know, the upper part up here is this very, very strong magenta color. And then it has out of these little kind of troughs that it has on the side, you know, they're almost like scales going up the stem. Inside there's like a little bud. And inside, or, you know, when that bud blooms, it's this beautiful kind of blue-violet flower. And the contrast between sort of the red violet and the blue violet are real striking on this. And here, I have a photo.
Hey, Charles,
Yes,
are you doing this because of me?
am I doing it because of you? No.
Because I sent you in a drawing that was flowers and was in ink?
No, you didn't have anything to do with it, okay?
Oh, I thought you were ready to ride me on this one.
Yeah, you're okay. I'm not gonna blame you, okay?
Are you gonna do watercolor on top of that, or are you gonna just do it all in ink?
Well, I'm gonna do it as an ink wash, okay?
Oh,
So I'm gonna share this. Now this is the photograph of the flower, okay? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Weird looking flower, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Here, let me blow it up.
It's unusual, not weird.
Well,
Very exotic looking.
exactly. Okay. Yeah. At any rate, if you start really looking at the structure of these, you know, they're really fascinating plants. You know, the plant world is full of interesting shapes. You know, good old Mother
The
Nature.
leaves
out
are
there.
beautiful.
Uh-huh.
The leaves are very beautiful.
Right. Yeah, they almost have a blue
Yeah.
color in them in
Right.
some cases, you know.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that's really striking about these is the kind of the broad contrast of color and the intensity, you know, just the intensity of this kind of magenta color. And it's real subtle, but, you know, in each of these petals, you'll see these little lighter veins, you know, running.
The veins blend in with the lavender look, or whatever you want to call the color,
Mhm.
of the flower that it's next to.
Uh-huh.
Like this lower one right there, the very bottom one that you have enlarged, the leaf next to it has that same or a similar color in the center of the leaf.
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. You know, you can spend, you know, literally hours and hours and hours looking at these and just seeing more and more stuff, how complicated they really are. You know, again, you know, Mother Nature is, you know, just this masterful thing at, you know, creating shapes and variations on things. So, you know, this is what I was working on. And okay, so let's stop sharing this so I can go back to the me screen. Okay, open that up a bit. So again, you know, can everybody see that fairly clearly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so that's my basic drawing. All right, and I'm not going to be adding, you know, anything to this. This is going to be sort of the foundation, you know, of, you know, what I'm going to be doing. Now, I took some artistic liberties, okay, and this is important, okay, because, you know, I could have run these leaves straight down, But what I wanted to do to kind of make a more complete design and drawing is, you see, I took these leaves and I brought everything down kind of to a point here, right? And so everything sort of comes together, and it all kind of comes out, you know, of that point.
Right.
And it really gives the piece a little more of a dynamic feeling. And if I had just straightened those lines out, you know, the drawing itself wouldn't be that exciting, right?
Yeah.
So even though you're sitting there, you know, and let's say you're drawing a flower, or, you know, a person or a house or something like that, you got to be thinking. You got to be thinking about, all right, this is what I'm seeing. All right, how am I going to tell the person who's going to see this in the end how exciting this was? You know, am I just going to copy it faithfully, or am I going to push it? I'm going to use my creativity and stuff to make an even, you know, better design, right? And so that's kind of where that creative license or your creativity comes into the process of art. Is it, again, you know, whatever you're looking at, you know, whatever you're experiencing, you know, you are a filter for that. And so take the things out of that you want and you need, and, you know, create something, you know, that's true to you, right? You don't have to copy it exactly, right? Does that make any sense?
Did you use a pencil
No,
before you did that?
no, I use that. That's all I've used so far.
I use a pencil to lightly do kind of the outline I want to do,
Uh-huh.
and then I use the ink to do.
Okay. And you can, all right? There's nothing really wrong with that. And a lot of people feel better, you know, because, you know, they're a little more assured about where they're going to be putting those lines down. But honestly, the way I kind of feel about that is, it's like painting. It's like, why am I going to take a pencil and draw out a face on my canvas if I'm only going to lose that whole drawing by putting paint on top of it? Okay. You know, when I can, in fact, just use the media and I can create, you know, as I go along. I can draw, and I can make those shapes and things. Now, you know, I have an issue with people sitting there and drawing out their painting before they paint. And the problem with that is that what they've done is they've gone through this process, they've made some observations, they've made some, and this is the important word, finite decisions, okay? It's like, this goes there, right? This is this big, yeah. Okay, so what happens in the painting process when you've lost that drawing? Because you've buried it in several layers of paint, and now all of a sudden you have to adjust something, you have to move something, right? Well, you no longer have that line to rely on, right? So why take the time to do it? Plus the fact that with all those lines there, and it being what I call a finite decision, what it does is it blocks you as an artist from being creative, from being, oh, okay, you know, it's somewhere in here, you know, and I can adjust it. You know, I can move it up, I can move it down, right? And, you know, and so what you have is you've got this process where you've drawn it out, and all of a sudden, all you're doing is you're filling in shapes, okay? One shape after another. And you've kind of lost sight of the thing that you're actually painting, right? Because you're busy just filling in shapes. And it's really easy for us as human beings to kind of switch our brain over to that mechanical process of I'm just filling in shapes rather than I'm experiencing a flower or I'm experiencing a person sitting in front of me who's alive and breathing and we're having a conversation, right? So it becomes a very, very different process.
Charles, you have a
Yeah.
problem with me sketching out the little lines?
Well,
Well, you said you had a problem with it. I mean,
yeah. Well, I do.
the rest of us weren't born artists like you were.
Well, I'll disagree with you about that. Okay. I think,
Number one, we don't have your experience. But number two is, for instance, I don't do portraits or people that much. And without a start of a pencil, like in a placement where the shadows might be with the line, yes, I will paint over that, but it gives me a proximity of where the turn of the cheekbone is when I've got just an oval shape painted
Okay.
in.
all right.
I can
Now-
see it's almost a must when you use watercolors to have some sort of guidelines to go by. Because in watercolors, you just don't just start flopping it up there where at will. You got to have a little guide to go by.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that the thumbnails that we would sketch in a sketchbook first?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you're kind of coming up with your overall design and working out your big blocks of light and dark and value by doing your little studies. And so by the time that you get to the final part, when you're actually executing the painting, whether it's watercolor, oil, or whatever, you know enough about it. So you've already kind of have enough experience of doing this thing, observing this thing that you're painting, that
How do you do the wash with ink?
that you really shouldn't need, that underdrawing. Now, okay, that being said, there's no wrong way to do it, okay? There isn't. Everybody is going to find the things that they are comfortable with. So I'm not telling you, there's no rule here that says don't draw it out. What I'm pointing out to you is the fact that your experience as an artist or as a human, right, in the process of creating a painting, a drawing, something like that, if you don't have those training wheels, right, that light pencil sketch down there, then it becomes a very different experience for you, right? And in some ways, I think it's a much richer experience than trying to, figure it all out, and very lightly, and then coming back in. And like I said, you put your mind in a different place, where what you're doing is you're just filling in blocks of color or value or texture or whatever that is. Okay. And what I'm trying to do is keep you out of that mechanical process and kind of keep you in that experiential process where, you're seeing something and responding to it. It's a light, it's a dark, how big is that shape? Where does it sit in relationship to these other shapes, right? And again, it keeps your brain thinking in a very different way, right? So Larry, are you there? Are you not talking to me, Larry?
No, I have to unmute myself.
Oh, okay. So in answer to your question, all right, if that's your process and, you feel better, sketching it out lightly, okay,
Very lightly. Like
yeah, that's fine.
number two, hard pencil.
Yeah, it's, again, there's, if you take 1,000 different artists and you ask them how they would approach this process, you're going to come up with 1,000 different ways, right? Because everybody is going to have a little bit different way to do it. So there is no, this is wrong and this is right. It's not that black and white, it's like most of life. It's out there in the gray areas, right? And, you're going to take things from me, you're going to take things from other artists that you've been around or that you've seen, and different ideas. And you're going to you know, keep practicing and trying these things until you find the things that feel true and right to you. You know, the things that you really, you know, are comfortable with doing, and you're going to create your own process. Okay. And that's really important, because that's the thing that's going to keep your work looking like your work, my work looking like my work. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. So I'm gonna play a video for you guys now. Okay. And this is on, you know, sketching or drawing, you know, with an ink wash technique, right? So we're going to do a little share. I think it's about a 20-minute video. Okay. And you've seen this guy before. He's a very happy guy.
Let's create an image of some cherries using ink wash. In this lesson, we'll use India ink and nylon brushes, and we'll use the technique ink wash to create this image of a couple of cherries. We'll start here with an H graphite pencil, sketching out the overall shape of both of the cherries. And we're working on watercolor paper for this image. And specifically, I'm using 140-pound hot press watercolor paper. And of course, you can use 140-pound cold press watercolor paper as well. The difference is in the texture. The hot press watercolor paper is much smoother compared to cold press watercolor paper. Now, of course, you can apply ink wash to any surface that you wish, but when you use a watercolor paper, it's going to minimize the buckling that happens when we start applying the ink wash to the surface. This is important to keep in mind. Of course, we want to minimize the buckling as much as possible. So as you can see here, we're starting just as we have with the other drawings in this series with a very loose approach. This is a fairly simple object here, clearly. It's basically just a couple of irregular spheres and a couple of stems here, but we're still drawing loosely to make sure that we find the correct lines. We're not too concerned about defining the contour lines at this point. Once we've got the overall general shape in place, then we can go in and refine the contour lines, making the outer shape of the cherries, each one of the cherries, and of course the stem as well, a little bit more clearly defined. Now, of course, we're using an H graphite pencil, which is a little bit harder, so we want to make sure that we don't put too much pressure on the pencil to create indentations in the surface of the paper. This paper is 100% cotton, so it's a little bit softer. Now, at this point, I've gone ahead and outlined all the areas where I see contrast in value, where I see a light value right next to a dark value. All right, let's go ahead and get some ink on the palette, and I'm just going to use India ink, and I'm looking to use the carbon black India ink. So if you look on the label of your ink, you see carbon black, you know that you're going to be using the darkest ink available. I'm going to add quite a bit of water to the ink here. We want to thin it out to a very light gray, and it might be helpful to use a test strip of paper before you go to your final surface. But if you do put down color that's too dark, you can always dab it up with a paper towel, so it's important to have a paper towel handy as well. Now, the process of ink wash is very, very similar to the process of watercolor painting. We're going to start with light applications and progressively layer darker applications over the top. So this is a slow and patient process. Since this approach is similar to painting with watercolor, some of the same techniques that we use with watercolor painting can be applied to ink wash. For example, we can apply ink to areas that are already wet. So in other words, if the surface is already wet and we apply ink to the surface, the ink's going to bleed in a similar way that we see with watercolor. We can also apply layers of translucent ink over the top of areas that have dried completely and slightly darken the value. And this is the approach that we're taking here. So we're starting with a very light application. Of course, you can see that we're working around all of the shapes that have been planned out for highlights.
What did you do,
Then once this initial application has dried, we're going to start layering progressively darker applications over the top.
You can't see anything.
Rush this process.
Oh, we can't?
It's always easier to make an area
Oh.
a bit darker if we need to,
somewhere.
than to make it lighter if we accidentally make it too dark. In fact, it's nearly impossible with ink wash. With watercolor paint,
How about now?
apply
Yeah.
water.
There it
It's
is.
okay.
There it is.
All right.
Darker
I'm
area
sorry.
is dry, and lift up some of the color. We don't have this advantage with ink wash. Once the ink is dried, it is there. So we need to be very careful and delicate here, especially in the beginning stages. We'll go ahead and lay a little bit of cast shadow underneath each one of these cherries. And if you look at the reference, you'll see that this shadow is connected as well. So we'll go ahead and connect these two shadows together with a little bit of water and just a touch of ink. And of course, after our initial application has dried, we're going to switch over to a smaller brush here and start getting a little bit darker with our applications. Now, the first brush I used was a number 4 round brush, and this is Grumbacher's Golden Edge Nylon Brush series. These are the same brushes that I use for watercolor painting. Now, of course, the ink will stain the brush itself, so it's important to have some water handy, of course, and keep your brush nice and clean throughout the process. The brush I'm using here, of course, is smaller, as I mentioned before. This is actually a 00 brush. Now, it's important to note, since I'm telling you the sizes of the brushes, that the numbers that are used to designate the size of the brush will vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. So a 00 in Grumbacher might be a slightly different size than a 00 that you'll find in another manufacturer. We'll add a bit of shadow here and there on both of the stems and at the top of the stem, of course, and a few areas where we see some of those darker shapes and imperfections. We'll go ahead and work down to the bottom of the base, and here you can see that some of the shapes that I'm addressing right now are quite a bit darker on our subject than what I'm painting at this point. But again, it's the process of slowly and gradually getting darker with our layered applications that will ultimately lead to a more representational appearance. We'll go ahead and start darkening up some of the shadows that we see on the body of the cherries at this point. Again, sticking with our 00 round nylon brush. Now, of course, we're making an effort to mimic the shapes of value that we see in the reference. But here again, it's important to understand that we don't have to make an exact replica of the subject that we're working from. We're not trying to create a copy of the photo. We're trying to create our own unique image here. And of course, this will naturally happen during the process. But too many people get caught up in trying to mimic or actually replicate a photograph. And they place too much emphasis on their success, or they evaluate their success based on this. Don't fall into that trap. Remember that your viewer is not going to see your photo reference unless, of course, you show them. The true measure of a piece of artwork is if it can stand on its own and be appreciated by the viewer. And you can see here at the bottom of the cherry, I've added a bit of darker value, but I'm using a bit of water to move this ink around in this particular area while it's still wet. Now, also notice that these cherries are also quite reflective. We can see, of course, the light reflecting off of it in these two strong highlights on both of the cherries, but we can also see some reflection happening against the cherries themselves. So on the cherry on the left, we can see on the right side of it, we see an area of darker value, and then on the cherry on the right, we also see an area of darker value on the left side. And this is because this is a reflection of each one of the cherries. So we'll go ahead and start darkening up this area right here on the right side of our first cherry. Again, taking care to leave open spaces where we see those strong highlights. And this is a concept to keep in mind whenever you're drawing or painting anything that's highly reflective. Of course, these cherries aren't highly reflective, but they are reflective to a certain degree. And whenever we see a reflective surface, we're typically going to see areas of high contrast between values. In other words, we'll see a dark value right next to a light value. And we can see this throughout both of these cherries. Now, another thing that you'll notice as we progress through this particular image is once the ink has been applied to the surface, or once it's initially applied to the surface, it might appear slightly darker than what it appears when it is completely dry. Of course, this is something to keep in mind as you work, and just keep in mind that you might have to go back over areas that you've already addressed. When you initially addressed them, you might have felt like they were dark enough, but then once dry, you see that you need to make them darker. And of course, this is perfectly natural. This is something that also sometimes happens with watercolor painting as well. Now, even though we see a strong highlight on the left side of the cherry, we still see a slight edge here as well. So we'll go ahead and define that with a lighter gray. And then it's back to continuing the process of darkening up those darker shadows and reflections that we see in the cherry. Now you'll also notice that ink wash sometimes has a little bit of a splotchy appearance associated with it. And this is just the nature of ink wash. The ink dries incredibly fast, so it is more difficult to create gradations or slow changes from dark to light with this medium. Although during the layering process, you can see that we can hide some of this splotchiness quite a bit. So it's important to take a layered approach. We also see a bit of texture on the bottom portion of the cherry. So by layering those darker values, we can leave a few open spaces, allowing some of those middle values and lighter tones to show through. Then it's back to the stem. After the stem has kind of had the time to dry to make some of those values a little bit darker. And then it's back to the body of the cherry again, making these values nice and dark, creating those reflections and areas of shadow. Now, value, of course, is relative. Value is the darkness or lightness of the color, of course, and by this point, you should be well acquainted with value. But the way that we understand value is all based on the values that are around that particular value. So in other words, we can make the highlights appear stronger by making the shadows around them stronger. And the reverse of this is true as well. If we were working with a lighter colored medium, we could add lighter tones and make the shadows feel stronger. So the more that we layer these applications and the darker our tone and value gets, the stronger our highlights get, the broader the range of value that we create, and our contrast also increases. There is a slight reflected highlight on the bottom portion of the cherry, so we're leaving a slightly lighter area right at the bottom. We'll go ahead and give a hint of an outline on the right side of the cherry, preserving that area of highlight before moving on to our second cherry. Now we've had quite a bit of experience with our first cherry layering applications of the ink. So our second cherry is going to go a little bit quicker. Again, we're going to start in the area where we see the darkest value, preserving the highlights as we make our layered applications. And since we're a little bit more experienced at this point, we can be a little bit bolder with our initial applications, making them slightly darker than we did with our first cherry. But we're still going to hold back just a little bit and make sure that we don't make those values too dark too quickly. Now, of course, we've already discussed hatching and cross-hatching. And when we did, we discussed the fact that our lines need to flow around the form of the subject. This is sometimes commonly referred to as cross-contour lines. Now, when we're working with a brush, nothing changes. We still need to consider the form of the subject that we're working with. Now, in this case, we're dealing with a cherry. So we have a rounded spherical type shape. It's clearly not a sphere, but it's spherical. This means that our directional strokes that we make with our brush should flow around the form of the subject as well. So you'll notice that I am thinking about these directional strokes. And for the most part, they're flowing vertically around the body of the cherry. And up near the top, they're going to curve slightly according to the curve of the cherry itself. So just because we're working with the brush doesn't mean that we need to abandon thinking about the form of the subject and the directional strokes that we make. This should also be considered. So you can see here, I'm preserving the highlight at the top part of the cherry and also adding a slight bit of slightly darker value on the right side where we still see a highlight that's not quite as strong as what we see at the top. We'll go ahead and start darkening up some of the elements that we see on this side of the stem. And then we'll darken up some of the elements on the left side of the stem too, with the left stem as well, since we can make comparisons between the values that we've applied to the right and the left. We can unify both of the stems. And then, of course, it's back to the body of the cherry, making the values nice and dark, especially where we see that reflection on the left side of it. And then, of course, to harmonize with our first cherry, we'll do the same thing on it. On the right side, of course, where we see the reflection from the cherry on the right. Of course, we want to make sure that our values are consistent throughout the image. So even though we've completed the cherry on the left, for the most part, we'll revisit it again in a moment, we can still expect to go back to it to make changes. So clearly the process continues here as we just gradually make these values darker. And of course, with each layered application, we gradually cover up some of that splotchier appearance that we see of our initial ink applications. Of course, we're paying attention to the photo reference throughout the process, taking note of the shapes of lighter value that we see and also the shapes of darker value, and just concentrating on trying to replicate those shapes in our image. Here we'll add that darker edge here, but you can see that this is quite a bit too dark. So I've got my paper towel handy. I'll just dab it real quickly, and there's the value. We'll go ahead and make the area of cast shadow that's the darkest a little bit darker. We can see this smaller shape of darker value underneath each one of the cherries. And then, of course, we can de-intensify it a little bit or lessen the intensity quite a bit by adding some water and dabbing with the paper towel while, of course, this is still wet. Then, just like we can with watercolor, we can go back and refine things a bit while the area is still wet. Then, of course, it's back to our first cherry, making some of the values a little bit darker, especially down here at the bottom portion of the cherry. You can see how rich that initial application is. But with a little bit of water, we can move this application around and, of course, accentuate more of that texture that we see. Then, of course, after our ink wash image has dried completely, we can use a kneaded eraser to erase away any remaining graphite lines. And now our image of a couple of cherries completed with ink wash is complete. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Remember, if you want to learn more about this course, there's a link in the...
Okay. What'd you guys think of that?
Terrific, terrific.
Okay, did you hear, anybody hear anything that they hadn't heard before?
That's a little picky for me. I wouldn't have put in all of the lines that he put into paint. I would just have suggested a lighter area for the for the shadows, or left the light the brightest.
Okay. Yeah.
If you wanted a question, if you wanted to go back to the cross hatching and cross hatching, I missed that lesson. How would I do that?
Oh, you would look up. You would look up his videos.
And who is he?
Oh, let's see. What it's Virtual Art Instructor is the site that you would go to.
Virtual Art Instruction. Thank you.
Yeah, on YouTube. And they have, you know, I mean, you can like take all kinds of lessons. They have lots and lots of lessons on there. And, you know, they're not free. You know, you sign up, you pay a fee, and then you can go through all these tutorials, right? But you can learn a lot of stuff that way. And it's a good resource. It's kind of like Proko. You know, Proko is the same thing, Proko. Again, you can like have a paid subscription to it, and then you can watch all of their videos on animation and figure drawing, and you know, where Proko kind of concentrates on just drawing. The Virtual Art Instructor, they talk about, you know, drawing, painting, you know, different media, and so you get kind of a broader range of things out there. right?
Thank
But
you.
yeah, the thing I want to emphasize about, about what he's doing is the fact that, again, working with India ink, most people think, okay, I take India ink and I put it in a brush or I put it in a pen and I make lines with it. And, after I put those lines down, I can't move them, right? Well, and that is true, okay? And that is sort of the beauty of working with, pen line and sketching. And it's also sort of the scary part too, because if you mess up, it's like, what do you do to correct it, right? But working with wash, and this wash technique, as I said, I relied heavily as an illustrator on this for many, many years because I could do things rather quickly, right? And, it's an additive process. You build it up. To me, it's very much so like the painting process, or using watercolor where you're laying in these lighter washes. And it's like every time you go over it, it gets darker and darker and darker. And so, to me, it's kind of a logical process. You start off with these lighter values, and you can kind of lightly sketch it in the lightest value. And then you begin to go over it again with successive layers of washes until you build it up to your stronger darks. And unlike watercolor, if you tried to do that with watercolor and let's say you put an area down and you let it dry and then you came back in with another wash on top of it, it's going to loosen up, the paint that's already dried and start moving that around in watercolor. In India ink, you don't have to worry about that. Once it's down and once it's dry, you're not moving it ever. It's there and it's permanent. Yeah.
So did we see a time lapse? Was he working and letting each stroke dry before or each section dry before he did the next one?
No, he wasn't. He was just building, more and more ink into it, until he built up the values that he needed. But, when he was working on, let's say like the stem, right? He'd work on it for a while and then he'd move down to the body of the cherry. By the time he got back up to the stem, it was pretty much so dry.
Right.
It's not a real, you're not putting tons and tons of water down on this, right?
Sure.
So it dries pretty quickly. Yes.
He said when painting values, use lighter tones to make shadows stronger. I didn't understand that part.
Okay. All right. What he was talking about is, all right, if you make, okay, let's say that you put down a light wash over the whole shape of the cherry, right? All right. And that's your first initial wash because now through taking these classes that there is no such thing as white, right? And that even highlights on surfaces are not as bright as a light source, right?
Right.
See, so you can establish a whole shape, right, with a fairly light value, right? And then as you go back in and you keep, building, darker and darker areas to that, it takes that initial area that may have looked a little darker when you put that wash on it, and it makes it much lighter in comparison, right? Mm-hmm. So the more you widen out that range of value, the lighter the lights feel and the darker the darks feel, right?
Is that just for ink washes?
Well, that's really for anything. Pencil, ink, yeah, that's, that works with anything. Drawing, painting, the darks affect the lights, in the sense that, the darker you make that dark, the lighter it makes that light look. See? Okay. Right. And vice versa. The lighter those lights are, it makes those darks appear to be darker. right?
You left those highlights on the cherry with the white paper. I didn't see him put a wash over that at all.
No, he didn't. And, you know, if I were doing that drawing, I probably would have done a little differently by just, and again, you know, initially kind of coming in with a light wash and, you know, kind of establishing the whole shape of the cherry. You know, because I know that my highlights cannot be pure white. You know, they're not emitting light. So I know that I'm going to knock that down just a little bit. And then as I kept building up my core shadows and things like that, those would begin to appear lighter and lighter. Okay. But the concept, you know, if you get these initial ideas and concepts down, you know, they're going to help in everything that you do, right? And, you know, working with ink, a lot of people are always afraid of, you know, oh, you know, ink is permanent and I can't move it around and everything. And the fact is, you know, working with ink, there are great advantages of working with an ink wash rather than graphite or rather than charcoal. And that's, again, because you can go through this process of building up those darks, you know, darker and darker, you know, until you get this really beautiful range of value that sometimes with graphite, you know, your pencil will only get so dark, you know, and does it ever really get truly black? No, it doesn't. You know, graphite pencil at best, all right, at the very, very darkest that you can get a graphite pencil, if you really begin to compare it on a value scale, is really about a number 7 or 8 value. And that's a really, really dark graphite pencil, okay? You cannot get graphite to really a number 10 value. It just, you know, it's just the nature of the media, so you're limited. But with ink, you know, you can get these really, really strong darks. You can get something pretty close to true black and a very strong value. So with ink washes, you can actually get a much wider range of value than you can with graphite or with charcoal. And so it has a lot more impact than just, you know, like a graphite drawing. Okay.
Now, the drawing that you did with the Sakura pen, are you going to use a wash to?
Yes.
Like you use the brush of the pen or just the ink itself?
No. What I'm going to do next, okay, you know, getting back to that. All right. Now this pen, okay, has got it's brown ink. All right. You know, they don't give me a color or anything really here. It's just archival quality. But it's, you know, they come in brown, black, blue, red.
Okay.
You know, they've got about 5 or 6 colors that you can get, okay? The black ink from Sakura actually is really good because it's actually one of, as far as using a pen, it has a pretty, really, really true black ink in it. The brown, like I said, is probably not as strong, but again, it gives you a warmer feeling to the drawing that I kind of like rather than doing everything in black. Now, what I'm gonna do is I've got my drawing, okay? And in fact, one of the things I was doing, and the reason the screen went away for a little while, is I went back and I pulled up the reference photo. I didn't know it was going to affect the video. But I was just laying in a little bit of tone, you know, a little bit of wash. So I was kind of experimenting up here at the top with a broad brush and some brown ink, you know, and water, and just kind of laying that in and beginning to lay a little bit of a tone on the flower itself, okay?
So you use like an ink wash actually with a brush and not the pen itself.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the initial drawing was done with that brush pen, but then I'm actually using brushes, okay? And I'll show you. Okay.
And the ink comes in a similar, like a sepia color, like that pen is.
Right. Yes. And I'm going to show it to you. It's right here. Okay. It's a bottle of brown ink. Okay. Now you can get this from different manufacturers. Okay. This happens to be a French company. And it's, I've had this for years and years. But, you know, it just comes in a little bottle and you can, you know, put some on a palette or in a watercolor tray. And again, you can thin it, you know, to make washes with, and or you can use it straight, and it's really pretty dark. And if with the brown, to get it really as strong and dark as you might want it for those really strong shadows, you might have to go over it 2 or 3 times, you know, to really build up the ink, to really get it to have as much punch, you know, as you may want. But, you know, as far as brushes go, you know, I'm going to work with 3 brushes. Okay. I've got a broad flat. Okay. I've got a liner brush. Okay. It's kind of a long, you know, hairs on it. And this is a kind of an old ratty brush, but it works really well. And then this is a synthetic brush. And again, it's like a liner brush. And I can get some pretty thin lines with this, you know, when I need them, right? But probably 85 to 90% of what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be working with this, right? This big flat brush. Now, when he was, you know, when he was working on that cherry, and this is a point of contention and disagreement between he and I, is he started working on, you know, with this like 00 brush, okay? And, you know, and that was not a big drawing or anything, but it took him a lot of effort and a lot of time to lay in those values and push them around, because he was working with this tiny little brush. You know, I kept kind of wanting to pull my hair out and go back and get a bigger brush, you know, because you could, you know, I have this debate with people all the time, but you can take this brush right here, and you can do everything with this brush that you could do with that tiny brush and more. Wow. And you can do it much more effectively than using this little tiny, you know, 3 or 4 hair brush. Now, where that 3 or 4 hair brush comes into play and where it's really effective is really kind of at that last, you know, you've got 95% of this, you know, image done. And you go back and you just want to, you know, like make some very precise lines in there or something, right? Then that becomes an effective tool, right? But look, with this tool right here, I can lay in like big, broad areas with it, but I can also use just the tip of it, and I can make very fine lines. And just, it's how I handle this tool. And if I learn how to use this tool correctly, you know, I don't need this that much.
Is there a way that you could show us how you would paint just you know, an area on the piece of the drawing using the tool?
Yeah, I'm going to.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's what I'm going to do during lunch, is I'm going to lay this out flat, and I'm going to do a quick little video recording, okay? And I'm probably not going to talk a lot. I may, you know, because the sound quality on the phone is kind of muffled.
Not good.
Yeah, and I would rather just go ahead and just paint and video that, and then I can talk you through it, you know, as I show you the video, okay? Yeah. But it will probably be like a, you know, quick little like 5-minute video. Yeah, it's not going to be real long, okay? But that's what I'm going to be doing, you know, over the lunch break. It's just kind of working with these and just doing a wash drawing, kind of, you know, trying to build up the values and things, you know, in those flowers, and kind of give you kind of a step-by-step, you know, how that develops. Okay?
Yes. Very good.
All right. Yeah, so we got like, you know, technically we got like 3 minutes left. Anybody got any questions?
I have a very basic question that I have to ask. Every time I saw or I heard something like, how many pounds of weight, how many grams for the watercolor
Right.
paper or whatever paper, what does it mean and what is good to buy and how to, sorry, I don't even know how to ask a question.
No, it's
Can you
fine,
explain
Linda.
it?
Okay, so when you buy watercolor paper, okay, or you buy a pad of watercolor paper, all right, you'll see that it's 80 pound, 90 pound, 140 pound, 300 pound, okay, and all that's talking about is how thick that paper is, okay? You know, so it's talking about the thickness of the paper. 300 pound is much, much thicker than 80 pound, all right? So 80 pound is kind of thin. Now, when you compare 80 pound watercolor paper to, say, bond paper is much thinner than that, right? Bond paper is really quite flimsy. And if you tried to do watercolor on bond paper, for example, or even an ink wash on bond paper, what you're going to get as soon as you get it wet, it's going to begin to wrinkle, you know, because it doesn't take water very well, right? And most bond paper has a very low, what we call rag content in it. And so it's mainly wood pulp. And when wood gets wet, what happens?
Disintegrates.
Well, it swells, see? And all of a sudden, you know, that paper gets all stretchy and buckly and everything else, you know, and it's not laying flat, so it's hard to work with. Now, watercolor paper, you know, as you get better qualities of watercolor paper, what they call the rag content goes up in the paper, which means that it's less wood pulp and more cotton fiber.
Mm.
Okay. And so when cotton fiber gets wet, it doesn't affect it. You know, it's like getting your clothes wet, right? Do your clothes bunch up and get wrinkly? No. You know, when you get a t-shirt or whatever, a cotton t-shirt, and it gets wet, what does it do? It kind of hangs, right?
Yeah.
Kind of flat, okay? So water doesn't affect it the same way. And that's why when they make watercolor paper, they make it, you know, really good watercolor papers are made out of what they call 100% rag paper. And so there's no wood pulp in it whatsoever. It's all just cotton fiber or natural type fibers that when you get them wet, they're not going to wrinkle. They're not going to buckle, okay? And they're going to lay flat for you. And so the higher the rag content, the better quality paper. Also, the more expensive it gets as well. But the weight of the watercolor paper that you were asking about, if you're working on a 300-pound watercolor paper, you can basically work on that paper and not have to stretch it, okay, to keep it flat, okay? And a lot of watercolor artists really like working on that 300-pound because they can take it out in the field and they don't have to stretch their paper and do a lot of preparation. They can just start putting paint on it and it won't buckle up and curl and stuff on them while they're working on it. If you're using 140-pound, usually that's a really pretty good weight. It will lay pretty flat. You can get a fair amount of water, you know, on that paper and it will still lay flat. Now, the issue with 140-pound is it will only take so much water. And then even after, you know, I mean, it's like once you get it real wet, then it's going to buckle and curl too, right? Where the 300-pound won't. And if you tried 80 or 90-pound, again, you know, it's not really good to work on really wet without stretching it, okay? Now, if you want to work really wet on an 80-pound, you know, piece of watercolor paper, then you take it and you put it in the bathtub, you wet it, right? So that the whole sheet is wet. And then you come in and on your drawing board, you lay it down, kind of squeegee out most of the water from it. And then you take a, like a painter's tape, or we used to use this paper tape, this gummed tape.
Masking tape.
Right. Well, no, not masking. Okay. Masking doesn't really work because masking won't adhere to it when it's really wet, right? So you have to use some kind of gum tape or something like that. And then they'll, put it around the edges of the paper, and not just on the corners. You got to do the whole side on all four sides. And then you set it aside and you let it dry for a while, right? As it dries, what happens, the paper, begins to shrink back down to its original size, and it pulls very, very tight. And you can, if you take your finger and you kind of thump on it, there's actually just a little bit of an airspace between it and the board where it's shrank and it's become taut. And that way, as you're painting on it, it's going to lay nice and flat for you. And that's with a lighter watercolor paper. If you spend the extra money, you get the 300 pound, you don't have to worry about it, okay? And then if you're particularly lazy like me, and you don't like stretching watercolor paper, my solution was I went out and I bought, it was a product, it was called Strathmore, and that's the name of the company, Strathmore double weight watercolor board. And it's an illustration board, but it's got a Strathmore, a really good quality Strathmore watercolor paper on the surface that you're painting on. And I never had to stretch anything. Because believe me, I stretched more watercolor paper when I was going through college than I ever wanted to, all right? And it's okay. It's just very time consuming. And if you can go out and buy that double weight watercolor board and then cut it down to a size that it will fit, into a mat or whatever, your final presentation, and work directly on it and never have to stretch it, that just eliminates a lot of steps for you, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I always like that as a product. Plus, I like the surface, of that Strathmore watercolor board, because it was really tough. You could get in there and you could really work the surface of that, and it wouldn't, peel and curl. I mean, you had to really abuse it to start, lifting some of the paper up or anything on it. So, so it was a really good product, and you can get it. It's not like really cheap, but it's not terribly expensive when you start comparing to going out and getting some of the better quality watercolor papers and things, because you can pay, $35, $40 for like a 20 by 30 inch sheet of like really fine quality watercolor paper. That gets expensive,
Is the board you're talking about, it is a smoother surface than the 300 pound watercolor paper, say Arctis?
But now, okay, the surface itself varies. Watercolor paper and this illustration board I'm talking about, Strathmore makes what they call a plate finish, which is smooth but not slick. They make a hot press, which is, very tight and very slick. And then they also make a cold press, and that's the bumpy, rough one, okay? And they also make, in some of the different products that they make, they also make what they call a rough. And that means that's really rough. It's kind of like painting on burlap instead of, painting on like cotton duck canvas, right? So you can get different surfaces as well as different weights of watercolor paper.
Well, what was your preference as to that Strathmore double weight?
Yeah, the double weight watercolor board, I usually got what they call, either the cold press or plate surface. Okay. And, sometimes, some stores you go to, they don't have the plate. They have the, they have the cold press. and that's fine. You know, I experimented a couple of times with the rough, you know, cold press, and you know, at the time it didn't really work for what I was doing because I was doing a lot of products and things, and you know, it needed kind of a little more control of the edges and things like that. You know, if I were trying to be very painterly and kind of you know, impressionistic and loose, I would probably work on the rough. Okay, because you know, you can get some beautiful effects, you know, with the watercolor or the ink washes and things settling into the low spots, and so it gives you you know, a more interesting surface. So, but it's, yeah, there's lots of choices out there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're saying that when you start learning how to do the watercolor, the paper you buy, but then if you buy the professional one, 200 pounds.
You mean 300 pounds?
You buy a general one?
Yeah, I mean,
don't have to choose.
Yeah, if you know, if I were going to take somebody and I were going to try to teach them how to, you know, use watercolor, right?
Right.
And they wanted to become a watercolor, you know, artist, right? And by the way, watercolor is not painting. Okay, you have painting, and then you have watercolor. And watercolor is a thing unto itself. Okay, it is not. Yeah, it is not painting. You know, I didn't do a watercolor painting. I did a watercolor. Period. Okay. Because it's a really very different process. All right. But if I were going to teach somebody how to work in watercolor, and that's, you know, that's the media that they preferred and everything that they did were going to be watercolor, then the thing I would require of them is don't waste your time on buying 80 or 90 pound watercolor paper. Okay. Ever. And go out and either buy that Strathmore double weight, you know, watercolor board. You can buy a double weight illustration board with a cold press surface that works pretty well too, all by itself. You know, or get 300 pound or 140 pound watercolor paper. And I would get them to buy a rough, a cold press, a plate, and a hot press, and get a sheet of each, and then do nothing but spend a week, you know, experimenting and, you know, playing with the medium and trying to get those, you know, some sections of those paper like really, really saturated and wet, and others a little bit drier, so that you could begin to see the effect of how the paper reacts with the color and the brush. Because that's really important in watercolor, because watercolor, you know, it's, the paper really does make the big difference. You know, I mean, you can use inexpensive watercolor, the actual medium, and if you do it on a good piece of good quality watercolor paper, it's so much easier to work with than if you get cheap paper and really expensive watercolor. You know, it's that paper will really undo you if you don't, you know, go that extra step and get a better surface to work on. Okay. You know, with painting, you know, in oil, acrylic, gouache, you know, any kind of painting medium, you can paint on almost anything. You know, you can paint on wood, you can paint on cardboard, you can paint on, you know, illustration board, and you can get away with doing it, and it doesn't really affect how the paint handles, you know, after you get the surface, you know, with the first layer of paint. You know, after that, you know, you're putting paint on top of paint, and again, it doesn't react that much. But with watercolor, that surface is always there that you're working with, and that's why it's critical to go ahead and get a better, you know, a better painting surface to work with, because your result will be so much better, you know, with just better quality paper, right? And the fact is that if you make a mistake in things, with the better quality paper, you can get it wet and you can really kind of pull that color out of there and correct it. Where if you had cheaper watercolor paper and you tried to do that, your paper falls apart. You know, the paper, if once you begin to get it so wet that it's really saturated, the paper just comes apart, starts peeling up on you. And then you've destroyed the whole piece, you know, and you can't correct that. So, yeah. If I were doing watercolor, I would spend a little more money on my paper, okay? You know, and be a little more particular about the surfaces that I work on, right? Because again, yeah, the end result is a vastly different thing, okay?
Very good.
So
I've always heard them saying about the weight, but I just don't understand what it is about.
Yeah.
Thank you,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, it's just another way of saying that this is a really thick, rigid piece of paper that you don't have to stretch, and this is a really thin, flimsy piece of paper that, yeah, you're going to have to take some time and prepare before you can work on it. Okay. Anybody got any more questions about that? All right. So let's all go to lunch. I'm gonna, you know, throw a couple of washes down on this drawing, and I'll see you guys at about 2 o'clock. Okay. And we'll be talking about some of your drawings. Yeah, and that's kind of about it today. Okay.
Okay.
And I'll be showing you kind of step by steps on, you know, on how this flower comes out. Let's all cross our fingers. Okay. All right. You guys enjoy your lunch.
Okay.
See
you
y'all.
too.
Okay, see you later.